And thanks to Sean for that fun report. And following President Trump's well-documented frustrations with Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve Chairman, that he appointed in his first term, he's now nominated Powell's successor as Kevin Warsh. Who is Warsh and what direction could he take the Fed? And how did he earn the president's trust? Joining us to break it all down and what it could mean for your financial outlook is Sarah Foster. She's an economic analyst over at Bankrate. Sarah, thanks for joining us this morning. Can you give us a little background on Warsh and how he was able to earn Trump's trust?
Thank you so much for having me this morning. Kevin Warsh is someone whose name has been floating around Fed circles for 20 plus years now. He has a resume that looks a lot like Powell's. He's a Stanford grad. He went to law school. He was also previously a Fed governor during the thick of the financial crisis and the Great Recession from 2006 to 2011. And, I think the way he gained the president's trust, the president has been a huge critic of Fed Chair Jerome Powell and hasn't been very easy on the central bank. He is someone who apparently also agrees with the president's willingness to lower interest rates. He looks at inflation. He thinks that interest rates can still come down a little bit. But of course, when we look at what his opinions were when he was on the central bank all those years ago, they're a little bit different today than they were back then. And that's probably where he's going to face a lot of pressure to prove that he will be independent from the White House.
Very interesting, Sarah, and I want to explore that further. So as you point out, Warsh has aired these criticisms over the Fed's handling of things. Based on his public comments, what reforms are you expecting?
We are looking really at, what kind of leader Kevin Warsh will be at bringing the committee to a consensus. So the Fed chair isn't necessarily more important than anybody else. I kind of think of him as, like a front man for a band. He's like Mick Jagger, if you listen to the Rolling Stones, Kurt Cobain, if you're more of a Nirvana fan. He's someone who is kind of the communicator in chief. But we also know that policymakers are pretty worried about lowering interest rates more right now because inflation is still above the Fed's target. So whether Kevin Warsh can come in and kind of persuade officials to see things from his point of view is going to be crucial if he's going to deliver those aggressively lower interest rates that the president wants. And the second kind of thing that I think we're looking at is a little bit more on the wonkier side, but it's about quantitative easing at the Fed. Kevin Warsh has been very critical of the Fed's bond buying programs, its massive asset-backed quantitative easing programs that really pushed longer-term interest rates like mortgage rates lower. He thinks the Fed should start to trim some of its balance sheet, which would, by effect, decrease the size of the money supply. It's very complicated, but to kind of put it into perspective for consumers, it's basically a step that could result in ultimately higher mortgage rates or higher interest rates because it's very complicated and difficult for the Fed to play out.
Yeah, very interesting analogy as well. Cobain, I don't know if he made it to his 30s. Mick is now, I think, in his 80s and looks more youthful than ever. Warsh himself has quite a youthful look. And I want to explore that topic you brought up because, as you point out, the Fed isn't ruled by its chair. You said it's the front man, it's the Jagger. The Board of Governors, when Warsh comes in and he tries to move it in a particular direction, what would that look like? What does the current body of governors, of board governors, look like on the Fed?
Yeah, so Kevin Warsh is one of 12 other votes. During any given time, there are 7 members of the Board of Governors who vote permanently on interest rate decisions. And then there's 5 regional reserve bank presidents. And if you were kind of going to stack all these faces side by side, to kind of arrange them by their views, you would find that there are, generally speaking, more hawkish presidents who are more worried about inflation. And then some of the more labor market focused officials are those on the Fed's 7-member Board of Governors. Of course, though, Kevin Warsh might not be the only official that President Trump gets to appoint. There could potentially be 2 more open seats on the Fed's board. We're waiting to hear, of course, the results of a Supreme Court oral argument. The Supreme Court is currently considering whether President Trump has the power to fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook over allegations of mortgage fraud that he raised and his administration raised about a year ago over the summer. Then, of course, the next question is whether Fed Chair Jerome Powell himself will stay on the Fed's board, because he's not just the chair, but he's also serving a role as governor. And if those three seats were to open up, then you could be potentially looking at a completely different committee, because the president would have the opportunity to appoint the majority of those officials.
Wow, and of course, the president has had the luck of the draw when it came to Supreme Court nominations, now potentially with the ability to put his stamp on the Fed makeup. Now, one of Trump's main criticisms of the Fed and Jerome Powell was that when it comes to positive growth, they wouldn't feed that growth by also dropping interest rates for this constant fear over inflation. The president arguing that you can have both. Does Warsh see eye to eye on this point? And if so, and they could achieve that, what would that mean for middle-class families?
It's difficult. As many Americans might know, the Fed has two goals. It's stable prices and maximum employment. They don't necessarily have a GDP target. So in theory, you could have massive growth and still lower interest rates. What really comes down to, though, is whether that growth is fueling inflation. And if it's paired with something like a productivity boom, that's something that Kevin Warsh has actually argued why you might be able to see lower interest rates even if the economy is growing. It's where the rubber meets the road, I think, is going to be a little bit difficult, because we haven't really seen any economic evidence of that yet. And of course, as there's been lots of optimism about AI, whether it's going to power the economy as strongly as many analysts and companies hope is another question. I think what Fed governor, when he was a governor, Kevin Warsh, kind of talked about a lot was actually the complete opposite. He was worried about inflation even at a time when unemployment was 9%. So it's a little bit different than how he viewed things a few years ago. But of course, hindsight is 2020. As for middle-class Americans, what I really would always caution them to do is to just make sure that you're taking a long-term perspective, that you're taking steps with your finances. You're going to probably see a lot of different Fed chairs over the years that you're saving for retirement. So if you have, a strategy that really works for you, is diversified, and you have an emergency fund that you can rely on if anything were to potentially go wrong in the economy, then no matter who is the chief central banker, you're going to be in a safe position.
Well, those are some wise words and well appreciated. Sarah Foster, economic analyst with Bankrate. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.